It seemed like a perfect plan. Trick a lonely old man and disappear with his money. But when he accepted without protest and began speaking in code, they understood he wasn't a victim, but the real hunter. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, like and subscribe so we can keep creating stories like this one. The plan seemed simple. Don Harold Vega, a lonely old man who lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix, was the perfect target for the plan that Jack, Robert, and Mike had schemed. The three friends, all around 30 years old, had meticulously researched his habits. Every afternoon, the old man walked to the same bakery, wore simple clothes, used an antique watch, and seemed to carry on his shoulders the weight of someone who had lived longer than he would have wanted. It wasn't a kidnapping they were planning, but something they considered more ingenious, convincing him that his building was structurally compromised to take him to a remote country house, where they would make him believe he needed to transfer his savings to a secure account. An elaborate scam, justified in their minds by the economic desperation they faced. On Thursday afternoon, as Don Harold returned from the bakery with his usual sweet bread, Jack approached him wearing a reflective vest and helmet, pretending to be a civil protection inspector. With urgent but reassuring words, he explained that they had detected dangerous cracks in the foundations of his building and that they needed to evacuate him immediately. Mike and Robert waited in a nearby van, also dressed in improvised uniforms. "Sir, there's no time to waste. We have a shelter prepared while the situation is being evaluated," Jack insisted, with convincing concern in his voice. Don Harold looked at him steadily, his dark eyes assessing the situation with disconcerting calm. He didn't protest, didn't ask questions, simply nodded and went up to collect some personal belongings. His passivity surprised them. They had anticipated more resistance. Within minutes, the old man was in the van heading to a small abandoned ranch on the outskirts of the city, a property that Mike had inherited from an uncle and that no one had visited for years. During the journey, Don Harold remained silent, looking out the window with an impassive expression. He didn't seem frightened or confused, which began to make the three friends uncomfortable. "Are you all right, Don Harold?" asked Robert, trying to break the silence. "I'll be better when we get there," replied the old man with a deep, serene voice that didn't match his fragile appearance. Upon arriving at the ranch, they installed him in a simple but comfortable room. The plan was to keep him there for a few days, gain his trust, and then proceed with the financial scam. However, from the first moment, something didn't fit. The old man didn't ask when he could return home, didn't ask to make calls. He simply observed, with eyes that seemed to absorb every detail, every gesture, every unspoken word. That same night, as Robert brought him dinner, Don Harold broke his silence with a question that made the young man's skin crawl. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" The phrase was met with a nervous laugh from Robert. "With a grandpa we're protecting, right?" he replied, maintaining the charade. Don Harold smiled, a toothless smile, but with something somber behind it that made Robert feel a shiver run down his spine. "That's what you think." That night, the three friends discussed the old man's words. Mike, the most pragmatic, insisted he was just an old man trying to seem mysterious. Jack suggested that perhaps he had some form of dementia. Robert, however, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind those tired eyes. The fee. Next morning, the first strange event occurred. The phone they used to communicate with each other suddenly stopped working. When they called the telephone company, they were informed that the line had been blocked by a federal security protocol. No one understood how something like that could have happened. "It's a coincidence," Mike insisted, although the tremor in his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. Don Harold, sitting by the window of his room, simply smiled when they brought him breakfast. During the second day, two different vehicles roamed the dirt road that gave access to the ranch. They were black cars with tinted windows that passed slowly, as if they were evaluating the place. The group believed it was a coincidence, perhaps workers from a nearby farm. But when Don Harold looked out the window, he simply said, "They already know where I am." The words fell like lead in the stomachs of the three friends. The third day, the situation became even stranger. Upon waking, they found a message written on the main door of the ranch. You're protected. For now. None of the three understood. Who would have left that message, and for whom was it? Don Harold, when shown a photo of the message, remained serene, as if he had been expecting it. "Do you know anything about this?" asked Jack, no longer able to maintain the civil protection inspector facade. "I know many things," replied the old man. "Things that you shouldn't have disturbed." That same afternoon, Robert decided to go to the nearby town to buy supplies, and while there used the ATM to check his bank account. They needed money to keep their plan going, although none of them were sure exactly what that plan was anymore. Upon inserting his card into the ATM, the unthinkable happened. Two men in civilian clothes approached him. They didn't arrest him, didn't accuse him of anything, simply invited him to accompany them. They took him to a windowless room in what appeared to be an abandoned administrative building. There they interrogated him for hours. Questions about Don Harold, about what they knew about him, about why they had taken him to the ranch. Robert, terrified, told them the whole truth, that it was a scam, that they didn't intend to hurt him, that it had all been Mike's idea. When they finally let him go, one of the men told him something that froze his blood. "You've messed with someone. You shouldn't have." Robert returned to the ranch, pale, trembling, with the certainty that they had made a serious mistake. The tension at the ranch increased by the hour. Robert shared his experience with Mike and Jack, and fear took hold of the group. "Who the hell is this old man?" whispered Mike, nervously looking toward the room where Don Harold was calmly reading a book he had found on the shelf. "I don't know, but those men, they seemed like agents of some kind. They asked me very specific questions," replied Robert, still shaking slightly. "We have to let him go and disappear," suggested Jack, "before it's too late." But something was stopping them. A mixture of curiosity and fear, the feeling that if they tried to escape, something worse could happen. That night, as they ate in silence, Don Harold observed them from his room through the half-open door. His eyes, more alive than ever, reflected something akin to amusement, as if he were watching a play whose ending he already knew. Mike, the most impulsive of the group, couldn't bear the tension any longer. He entered Don Harold's room and confronted him directly. "Who are you really? Why are people looking for you?" The old man looked up from his book and smiled calmly. "Sit down, Mike, it's time we had a conversation." The way he pronounced his name, as if he had known him all his life, made Mike obey automatically. "You believed you were manipulating a defenseless old man," began Don Harold, his voice acquiring a firmer, more authoritative tone. "But the truth is that I chose you. I've been watching you for weeks." Mike felt the air leave his lungs. "What? Why?" "Because I needed a way to come back. And you three, with your financial problems and poorly disguised desperation, were perfect for my purposes." Don Harold rose slowly, and as he did so, his posture changed. He no longer seemed like a fragile old man. There was a new strength in his movements, a dignity that was intimidating. "I'm not what I appear to be, Mike. For 30 years, I was one of the most influential men in the financial, intelligence sector of this country. I knew everyone's secrets, businessmen, politicians, even those cartels they're so afraid to mention. I didn't work with them. I controlled them with information." Mike instinctively backed away. 5 years ago, I decided to disappear. I faked my financial ruin, retired to live a simple life. But you have brought me back. As Don Harold spoke, Mike noticed subtle changes in his appearance. It was as if an invisible mask was falling, revealing a completely different man beneath that facade of old age. "What do you want from us?" Mike finally asked with a dry mouth. "For now, to continue with the game. Tomorrow the real test will begin." The dawn of the fourth day brought more surprises. Jack, who had gone out early to investigate the surroundings, returned with alarming news. "There are cars watching all the exits from the road. They're not police, but they're definitely professionals." Robert and Mike exchanged concerned looks. Don Harold, who now ate breakfast with them at the main table as if he owned the ranch, simply nodded. "They're my former colleagues. They're waiting for my signal." "What signal?" asked Jack. The one that will tell them if you're my allies or my captors, replied the old man naturally, as if commenting on the weather. It depends on you how I see you. The proposal that Don Harold made next changed the course of everything. It wasn't a direct threat, but an offer that seemed too good to be true. You will help me complete a mission, and in return, I will not only forget this little incident, but I'll give you what you really need. And what do you think we need? Asked Mike with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. Mike Harris, 32 years old, former engineering student who dropped out of university in his last year due to financial problems. Since then, you've jumped from job to job, accumulating debts that now amount to almost $100,000. The precision of the information made Mike pale. Don Harold continued, turning to Jack. Jack Foster, 29 years old, son of a merchant, who lost everything in the crisis. You've been trying to support your father and younger sister by selling insurance that nobody wants to buy. Finally, he looked at Robert. And Robert Martin, 34 years old, with a 6-year-old son who needs expensive medical treatment that you cannot afford. The silence that followed was so dense it could almost be touched. The three friends looked at each other, astonished by the amount of personal information this supposed defenseless old man had about them. How do you know all this? Robert finally managed to articulate. I already told you. For decades, my job was to know things about people, things that could be useful. Don Harold took out of his pocket a phone that none of them had seen before. It was a modern, high-end model. This phone is secure. With it, you will do exactly what I'm going to tell you. The mission that Don Harold entrusted to them was apparently simple, although none of them fully understood its implications. They had to contact 3 different people, using specific codes and phrases that the old man dictated with military precision. They should not ask questions about the content of the messages, just transmit them exactly as indicated. The first to leave was Mike, heading to a cafe in downtown Phoenix, where he was to meet a middle-aged woman. The instructions were clear. Sit at a specific table, order an American coffee, wait for her to initiate the conversation, and then respond with the memorized phrases. Everything seemed like an elaborate play or a spy movie, but Mike followed, the instructions to the letter, too frightened to disobey. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Don Harold began a more visible transformation. He asked Robert to get him new clothes, specifically a tailored suit from a particular store in the city. He also requested hair products, high-end facial creams, and a series of items that seemed more appropriate for a high-level executive than a retiree. Robert, following precise orders, returned with everything requested. The metamorphosis was surprising. With each garment he put on, with each product he applied to his face and hair, Don Harold Vega left behind the fragile old man and revealed an imposing businessman. His posture was now completely upright, his gaze sharp and penetrating, his voice clear and authoritative. "Who are you really?" asked Robert, unable to contain his amazement. "My real name is Alexander Morgan," replied the man they until recently knew as Don Harold, as he adjusted the knot of an Italian silk tie. "For more than 3 decades, I directed a financial intelligence network that operated in the shadows of the system." His voice had changed as much as his appearance. Fed was now deep, confident, with a slight accent that denoted international education. "I wasn't part of the government, nor any criminal organization. I was, let's say, an intermediary, someone who knew everyone's secrets and knew how to use them to maintain a certain balance." Robert listened, fascinated and terrified in equal parts. This man, who now presented himself as Alexander Morgan, bore no resemblance to the old man they had brought to the ranch 4 days ago. It was as if another, completely different person had emerged from that shell of feigned old age. Why pretend to be an old man? Why live like that? Alexander looked in the mirror as he finished getting ready. He now appeared to be a well-maintained 60-year-old, instead of the 80 suggested by his previous disguise. "Because there are very powerful people who would prefer to see me permanently disappeared. 5 years ago, when I decided to retire, I had to negotiate my exit. The condition was simple. I would completely disappear, not use my influence or reveal what I know." "And now you're breaking that agreement?" asked Robert, beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation they had unwittingly gotten themselves into. Alexander smiled with something that seemed like nostalgia. Not exactly. I'm testing if it still works, if my name still has the power it once had. At that moment, Mike returned from the cafe. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. When he saw Alexander completely transformed, he stopped short. Don Harold. Alexander, Robert corrected. His name is Alexander Morgan. Mike collapsed into a chair, visibly shaken. The woman. At the cafe, she recognized me before I said a word. She called me by my full name. And when I gave her the message, she simply nodded and said, "So it's true. He's back." "Who the hell are you?" Alexander didn't respond directly. Instead, he checked his watch, now an elegant Swiss model, that he had requested along with the suit, and asked, "Did she give you anything for me?" Mike nodded and took a small flash drive from his pocket. She said, "Everything you asked for is here." Alexander took the device with a satisfied smile. "Perfect. Now we need a computer." The next phase of the plan involved Jack, who had to visit a particular office in a corporate building in the city's financial center. Unlike Mike, his instructions were to deliver a written message, sealed, in an envelope that Alexander prepared personally. Ask for Edward Walters. Only deliver the envelope directly to him, no one else. Jack left nervous but determined. Alexander Morgan's transformation had eliminated any doubt about the seriousness of the situation. He was no longer an old man they were scamming. He was a powerful and mysterious man who, for some reason, had chosen them to be part of his plans. While they waited, Alexander connected the flash drive to a laptop that Robert had brought following his instructions. What they saw on the screen left Mike and Robert speechless. Confidential documents, financial records, private communications from some of the most important companies in America. "This is illegal," murmured Robert. "This is power," Alexander corrected. True power doesn't reside in money or strength, but in information. Whoever controls information controls everything else. Hours passed, and Jack didn't return. Concern began to grow between Mike and Robert. What if he had been detained? What if this whole affair was more dangerous than it seemed? Alexander, however, remained calm, reviewing the documents on the flash drive with the concentration of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. "Don't worry about Jack," he finally said, without looking up from the screen. "He'll be fine, as long as he followed my instructions exactly." Another hour passed before they heard a vehicle approaching the ranch, but it wasn't the car Jack had left in. It was a luxury black SUV with tinted windows. Mike looked out the window, alarmed. "There are people outside. They look important." Alexander calmly closed the laptop and stood up, smoothing his suit. "They're my guests. Open the door." Robert and Mike exchanged looks of uncertainty, but obeyed. Upon opening the main door, they found themselves facing three men dressed in impeccable suits. Behind them, Jack waited next to the SUV, with an expression that mixed relief and confusion. "Mr. Morgan," greeted the man who seemed to lead the group, slightly bowing his head in respect. "It's been a long time." 5 years, 2 months, and 17 days to be exact, Edward," replied Alexander, inviting them to enter with an elegant gesture. "I'm glad to see you still respond to my call." The men entered the ranch, and it was then that Robert and Mike understood they were witnessing a meeting between people with a level of power and influence they could barely imagine. Jack joined his friends, whispering, "That man, Edward Walters, is the Chief Operating Officer of Global Financial Security. It's one of the most important cybersecurity companies on the continent." The meeting took place in the main dining room of the ranch. Alexander asked the three friends to prepare coffee and then wait in the kitchen. From there, they could hear fragments of the conversation. They spoke in coded terms with references to activated protocols, compromised systems, and guarantees of silence. Occasionally, the voices rose enough to understand they were negotiating something important, something that involved large sums of money and promises of protection. After almost 2 hours, the meeting concluded. The men said goodbye to Alexander, with the same respect with which they had arrived, promising to re-establish previous agreements with the discussed modifications. When they left, Alexander returned to the dining room with a satisfied expression. "It seems my name still means something after all," he commented, pouring himself a glass of wine that the visitors had brought as a gift. "What just happened?" asked Mike, unable to contain his curiosity. "I just reclaimed my place on the board," Alexander replied cryptically, "and you just gained powerful allies." The revelation that followed left the three friends astonished. Alexander explained that Edward Walters and his associates had been former business partners, but also rivals who benefited greatly when he decided to disappear. For years, they had used the information and methods he had developed to build a digital security empire that now protected and occasionally spied on the main corporations in the country. "What they didn't know," continued Alexander, "is that I left backdoors in all my systems, small access points that only I know about, and that allow me to regain control when I want." What Alexander had done, through the messages sent by Mike and Jack, was to demonstrate that he still had that access. He had extracted confidential information from his own systems as proof of his persistent power, and now was using that leverage to renegotiate his position. "But what does all this have to do with us?" asked Robert, still trying to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Alexander looked at the three of them with a calculating expression, but not devoid of a certain warmth. "You are my alibi, my vehicle for return, but you could also be something more." That night, as they dined together in a strangely domestic atmosphere considering the circumstances, Alexander offered them a proposal that would change their lives. "I need trustworthy people by my side, people who aren't linked to my past, who can move freely without raising suspicions." Mike, always the most direct, asked, "Are you offering us a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," Alexander corrected. "The opportunity to solve your financial problems, yes, but also to learn skills that very few possess, to see the world as it really works." Robert thought about his son, about the treatment he couldn't afford. Jack remembered his father's debts and his sister's uncertain future. Mike reflected on his years of struggle, jumping from one precarious job to another. The offer was tempting, but also frightening. "And what would happen if we say no?" Jack finally asked. Alexander's smile tightened slightly. "You're free to reject my offer, of course. I'll give you enough money to resolve your most immediate problems as thanks for your involuntary help, and we'll part ways without resentment." He made a significant pause before continuing. "But once you reject it, there will be no second chance. And you'll have to completely forget everything you've seen and heard these days." The three friends looked at each other, silently communicating. They were at a crossroads that none had anticipated when they planned their little scam. Now before them opened a path that promised to solve their problems, but would also lead them to a world of secrets and power they could barely comprehend. The next morning dawned with unusual clarity over the ranch. The three friends had spent the night discussing Alexander's proposal, weighing risks and benefits, imagining possible futures. In the end, they reached a unanimous decision. They would accept the offer. Not just for the money, but also for the adrenaline, for the curiosity, for the possibility of being part of something greater than themselves. When they communicated it to Alexander during breakfast, he nodded as if he had already anticipated their response. "Let's begin then," he said, spreading out a map of Phoenix on the table. "This will be our first project together." The plan he presented was intriguing in its simplicity and scope. Alexander explained that he needed to establish a base of operations that would appear completely innocuous from the outside, but would have the technological conditions necessary for his activities. "A coffee shop," he proposed. "A coffee shop with high-speed internet, diverse clientele, and a strategic location near the financial district." Mike, with his incomplete engineering training, would be in charge of designing and supervising the installation of the hidden technical infrastructure. Jack, with his experience in sales, would develop the commercial facade and the business plan. Robert, The most charismatic of the group would be the public face of the establishment, the host who would make everyone feel welcome while discreetly monitoring who came and went. But a coffee shop takes time to establish, to gain clientele, objected Jack, always pragmatic. Alexander's smile was that of someone who had already considered all the angles. Not if we buy one that's already popular and simply improve it. I have the perfect place in mind. That same afternoon, they visited Luminous Cafe, an establishment with decades of history in the heart of Phoenix. It was a place beloved by locals and tourists, with high ceilings, large windows overlooking a busy street, and a reputation for excellent coffee and a welcoming atmosphere. It was also, according to Alexander, about to close due to financial problems of the owner. Frank Williams, 72 years old, widower, 2 children living abroad who aren't interested in the family business. He has considerable mortgage debt and health problems that prevent him from continuing to run the business. The precision of the information continued to amaze the 3 friends. "How do you know all that?" asked Robert. "I have my methods," replied Alexander with an enigmatic smile. "The important thing is that tomorrow we'll meet with him to make an offer." The meeting with Frank was emotional and revealing. The old man, genuinely affected by having to sell the business of his life, found in Alexander someone who seemed to understand the sentimental value beyond the financial. "I don't want it to change," explained Frank, his eyes moistening. "I've seen so many traditional places turn into soulless franchises." Alexander, showing a surprisingly empathetic facet, put a hand on the old man's shoulder. "I promise you will respect the essence of Luminous Cafe. We just want to update it and ensure it remains part of Phoenix for many more decades." The offer they made was generous, enough to pay all his debts with a considerable extra for his retirement and a small percentage of participation that would allow him to continue feeling the cafe was his without the worries of daily administration. It also included an agreement that Frank could continue visiting the cafe whenever he wanted, with a table permanently reserved in his name. Frank accepted with tears in his eyes and a handshake that sealed something more than a commercial deal. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. During the day, Luminous Cafe continued to operate normally, with Frank gradually introducing Robert as the new manager. At night, after closing, Mike supervised a team of technicians who discreetly installed a special wiring system, hidden servers, and advanced communication technology in a basement that many didn't even know existed. Jack, meanwhile, met with suppliers, designed a new menu that honored the classics but introduced modern options, and developed a subtle but effective marketing strategy. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Some nights he disappeared without explanation, returning at dawn with new contacts, information, or ideas. Other times, he spent hours locked in his improvised office at the ranch, making calls in languages that none of the 3 friends recognized. It was like watching an invisible conductor, moving strings that connected seemingly separate worlds. One night, while reviewing the progress in the cafe's renovation, Alexander received a call that changed his usually controlled expression. Something had happened, something he hadn't foreseen. "I need you to prepare the van," he ordered after hanging up. "We have to go to New York City tonight." The night journey was tense. Alexander barely spoke, focused on a tablet where he reviewed documents with a grave expression. Only when they were halfway there at a stop to refuel did he offer an explanation. "One of my former associates has tried to track me through you, a man named James Torres, someone who has many reasons to want to find me, or ensure I remain." I disappeared. The 3 friends exchanged concerned looks. "Are we in danger?" Mike asked directly. Alexander considered the question seriously. "Not while you're with me, but we need to accelerate our plans, and for that, I need to recover something. I left in the capital 5 years ago." They arrived in New York City shortly before dawn. Alexander guided them to a luxury residential building in the Upper East Side. The night doorman recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed, and let them in with a respectful bow that suggested Alexander had been more than a simple resident. The apartment they went up to was impeccable, as if someone had kept it ready for his return at any moment. Spacious, elegant, with panoramic views of the city. It was the kind of residence that only someone with considerable power and money could afford. "Welcome to my true home," said Alexander, as he activated the lights with a voice command. Or at least one of them. What followed was one revelation after another. Alexander opened a hidden safe behind an original painting by Jackson Pollock, extracting documents, electronic devices, and a small black notebook that he carefully stored in the inside pocket of his jacket. "This," he said, holding the notebook for a moment before storing it, "is more valuable than all the gold in the world. It contains codes, passwords, and contacts that can open doors that most people don't even know exist." They spent the day in the apartment, with Alexander distributing tasks and explaining the next phase of his plan. It was no longer just about Luminous Cafe and its hidden infrastructure. Now he spoke of a wider network, international connections, financial movements that could influence entire markets. The three friends listened, assimilating as much information as they could, aware that they were entering increasingly deeper waters. By nightfall, when they were finally preparing to return to Phoenix, they received an unexpected visit. The intercom announced Edward Walters, the same man who had visited the ranch days ago. Alexander received him with studied caution. "Edward, I don't recall inviting you." The man entered with confidence, evaluating the three friends with a calculating look before focusing on Alexander. "James knows you're back. He's mobilizing resources, contacting former allies." Edward made a significant pause, "including me." The tension in the room was palpable. Alexander maintained a neutral expression, but his eyes revealed he was evaluating multiple scenarios simultaneously. "And have you come to warn me or to threaten me?" "I've come to offer you a deal," replied Edward. "James wants to eliminate any threat to his current position. I prefer a more collaborative approach." What followed was a subtle but intense negotiation. Edward explained that since Alexander's disappearance, a new balance of power had been created in the world of finance and business intelligence. James Torres, previously a secondary player, had risen to become one of the main security consultants for multinational corporations and government entities. "He's not going to give that up without a fight," warned Edward. Alexander listened to everything with attention, occasionally asking precise questions that revealed his deep understanding of the geopolitical and financial landscape. Finally, after almost an hour, he proposed his counter-proposal. "I'm not looking to dethrone anyone, Edward. I just want my freedom and the guarantee that certain information will remain where it should be." He took the small black notebook from his pocket, holding it like a talisman. "Let's say this is my insurance policy. As long as it remains intact, we can all coexist peacefully." Edward seemed to understand the implicit message. If something happened to Alexander, the information in that notebook, information that could potentially compromise many powerful people, would be revealed. "I can work with that," he finally conceded. "But you'll need to make a demonstration of good faith to convince James." "You'll have it," promised Alexander. "In 3 days, you'll receive a sample of what could come to light and what will remain hidden if we all respect our spaces." After Edward left, the three friends finally expressed their accumulated concerns. "What exactly have we gotten ourselves into?" asked Jack, verbalizing what everyone was thinking. "Are we talking about corporate espionage? Blackmail?" Alexander looked at each of them with a serious expression, but not lacking in empathy. "We're talking about power, about information, and about how both move the world, while most people remain ignorant of the true mechanisms behind the decisions that affect their lives." He paused, carefully considering his next words. "We're not villains in this story, we're balancers. People who know the true rules of the game and who can use them for their own benefit, yes, but also to prevent others from abusing the system too much." Robert, who had remained especially quiet, finally spoke. "And what about us? What role do we play exactly in all this?" Alexander's smile softened, showing for the first time a glimpse of genuine affection toward them. "You, my unexpected accomplices, are my new beginning, my team, my apprentices, if you want to see it that way." He extended his hand, offering a gesture of union that symbolized much more than a simple business agreement. Are you ready for the next step? Luminous Cafe reopened its doors exactly 3 weeks after the purchase. The renovation had been subtle but effective. The traditional charm remained intact, but was now complemented with modern touches, an ultra-fast internet connection, and workspaces designed to attract professionals and students. Frank, present as a guest of honor at the inauguration, shed tears of joy upon seeing that the essence of his beloved cafe was still alive. What no one knew, except the 4 architects of this transformation, was that under the appearance of a traditional establishment with contemporary touches, operated one of the most sophisticated financial intelligence centers in the country. The basement, completely renovated and equipped with cutting-edge technology, was the heart of an operation that extended its tentacles far beyond the picturesque streets of Phoenix. From there, Alexander and his new team monitored information flows, intercepted corporate communications, and meticulously built a network of influence that grew day by day. The demonstration of good faith promised to Edward materialized in the form of a controlled leak. Compromising information about questionable practices of a mining corporation mysteriously appeared in the hands of a respected investigative journalist. The news caused a stir in business circles, provoking a significant drop in the implicated company's shares, a company that, coincidentally, had recently rejected James Torres's consulting services. The message was clear. Alexander could cause damage if provoked, but he could also be a valuable ally if his terms were respected. A week after the leak, Edward returned with news. James has understood the message. He's willing to negotiate a non-interference agreement. The meeting was scheduled to take place on neutral ground, an exclusive country house in the Hamptons, owned by a foreign diplomat who occasionally lent it for meetings that required absolute discretion. As they prepared for the trip, the 3 friends reflected on the transformation they had experienced in just 1 month. Mike, previously a frustrated and indebted engineer, now directed an elite technical team, designing security systems that were both defensive and offensive. Jack had discovered a natural talent for strategic negotiation, becoming the public face of the group's legitimate operations. Robert, with his charisma and ability to read people, had transformed into the perfect link between the underground world of information and the day-to-day of the cafe. "I never imagined we would end up like this when we planned that scam," commented Mike the night before the crucial meeting, as the 4 shared a bottle of special reserve bourbon. "Life has interesting ways of taking us exactly where we need to be," replied Alexander, contemplating the amber liquid in his glass. "You thought you were manipulating a defenseless old man and ended up being catalysts for my return. I thought I was building a perfect retirement and ended up rediscovering my purpose thanks to you." It was the first time Alexander had shown himself so open, so vulnerable to them. Perhaps it was the bourbon, or perhaps the anticipation of what was to come, but at that moment they seemed to transcend the mentor-apprentice relationship to become something closer to a chosen family, united by shared secrets and purposes. The meeting in the Hamptons was tense but productive. James Torres, a stocky man with small calculating eyes, observed Alexander with a mixture of respect and wariness. At first, he avoided looking directly at Mike, Jack, and Robert, as if they were mere accessories in a negotiation between titans. But as the conversation progressed, it was evident that he was underestimating them. The demonstration came when Mike intervened with a technical analysis so precise about the security systems used by James's company that he couldn't hide his surprise. Then Jack detailed discrepancies in the firm's recent contracts, information that only someone with internal access could know. Finally, Robert casually mentioned personal details of James's life, his recent divorce, the university where his daughter studied, the name of his yacht, that sent an unequivocal message. They were more informed than anyone could suspect. By the end of the day, an agreement was reached. James would recognize Alexander's return and guarantee him a territory of operations without interference. In exchange, Alexander would not compete directly in certain sectors that James considered his, and both would share information about common threats. It was a fragile armistice, based more on mutual fear than trust, but enough to allow Alexander to consolidate his position without worrying about attacks from that flank. The return to Phoenix brought with it a new phase in the operation. With the immediate threat neutralized, Alexander could focus on his long-term vision. One night he gathered his 3 protégés in the private room of the basement to reveal his true intentions to them. "What we're building is not just a business, not even an information empire," he explained, displaying diagrams and concept maps on the main screen. "It's a new system of power balance." The plan was ambitious, to create an independent intelligence network that would serve as a counterweight to the excesses of both large corporations and governmental entities. They would not act as judges or avengers, but as guardians of a certain order, ensuring that no entity accumulated too much power without checks. "All systems eventually become corrupt when power concentrates without oversight," continued Alexander. "Our role is to be that invisible oversight, to maintain balance, to prevent the most egregious abuses without falling into the trap of absolute power ourselves." The practical form of this abstract ideal would materialize through a network of nodes, seemingly conventional businesses like Luminous Cafe, strategically located in key cities. Each node would function as a center for gathering and analyzing information, but also as a safe space for discrete meetings, data exchanges, and, when necessary, temporary refuge. The first additional node would be established in Miami, a growing city with connections to both the rest of the United States and Central America and the Caribbean. Jack would be in charge of its development, applying what he had learned in Phoenix, but adapting it to the local peculiarities. The second would be located in Dallas, the industrial heart of the country, where Mike would oversee the creation of an even more advanced technological infrastructure than that of the original cafe. Robert would remain in Phoenix, consolidating the primary node and coordinating communications between all points of the nascent network. "And you?" asked Robert, noting that Alexander had not mentioned his own role in this expansion. "I will be the shadow," he replied with an enigmatic smile. "The man everyone knows but no one sees, moving between nodes, connecting dots, ensuring that the vision remains pure as it grows." The following months were of intense activity. Jack left for Miami, where he acquired a small bookstore with an adjoining cafe that would serve as the perfect cover. Mike traveled frequently to Dallas, establishing contacts and looking for the ideal location for the industrial node. Robert completely transformed Luminous Cafe into a respected cultural and business center, attracting a diverse clientele that ranged from students to high-level executives, many of whom did not suspect that their conversations were discreetly monitored and analyzed in search of valuable information. Alexander, true to his word, moved like a shadow between these operations. Sometimes he disappeared for weeks, returning with new contacts, opportunities, or warnings about potential threats. Other times, he remained in Phoenix for days, refining strategies, teaching advanced information analysis techniques, or simply sharing stories from his past that served as both lessons and warnings. 6 months after the initial encounter with Don Harold on that street in Phoenix, the landscape had changed radically for everyone. The network, though still in its infancy, was beginning to show its potential. They had neutralized 2 attempts at massive corruption, prevented the collapse of a century-old family business facing a hostile takeover, and gathered enough compromising information on various power players to guarantee their own safety for a good while. But the most profound change was personal. Mike, previously embittered by lost opportunities, now flourished as an innovator, developing technological solutions that others would consider impossible. Jack had discovered a talent for identifying patterns in human behavior and information flows that made him an exceptional analyst. Robert had perfected his natural ability to connect with people, transforming it into a precision tool for extracting information without his sources even noticing. And Alexander, the master of shadows, seemed rejuvenated by this new purpose, by the opportunity to build something that transcended his previous legacy. One night, while celebrating the successful opening of the Miami node, Alexander gave each of them a small object, a stylographic pen of normal appearance but with incorporated technology that served both as an encrypted communication tool and as an access key to all the network's systems. "These pens are more than tools," he explained. "They are a symbol of what we're building together, something that appears ordinary at first glance, but contains extraordinary power when you know how to use it. He raised his glass in a toast. To the luminous network, to the balance we maintain, and to the four men who met by chance and decided to change the world from the shadows. The toast resonated with a promise that went beyond words. They had begun as strangers united by a deception, and now they were the architects of something larger than themselves, guardians of an invisible but vital balance. Mike looked at his companions and thought about how far they had come since that day when they saw a lonely old man walking to the bakery. None of them could have imagined that this seemingly defenseless man would lead them to discover not only a hidden world of power and influence, but also their own unexplored potentials. The story that began with a simple plan to deceive an old man had culminated in the creation of a sophisticated network of intelligence and counterpower. Don Harold, the vulnerable man that no one would miss, had transformed into Alexander Morgan, the architect of shadows. And three desperate scammers had become the pillars of a new order, protectors of a balance that the world didn't even know it needed. As the celebration continued, Alexander briefly stepped aside to observe his protégés. His gaze reflected pride, but also a keen awareness of the challenges that still awaited them. The game was just beginning, and the pieces were finally in place. The man who once pretended to be a lonely old man to escape the world was now ready to reinvent it, with the help of three unlikely allies who had found their true purpose in the shadows of his influence. And so, in the heart of America, under the appearance of ordinary businesses, the luminous network extended its invisible threads, weaving a new balance of power that would change the course of many lives without anyone knowing exactly why or how it had happened. Only four men would share the complete secret, united by a fortuitous encounter that proved that. Sometimes, the greatest changes begin with the simplest plans and the most unsuspected people. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Alexander Morgan and his three apprentices has captivated you as much as it did us in creating it. To continue this journey through the labyrinths of power and second chances, we've prepared a special playlist with equally fascinating stories about personal reinventions and intertwined destinies. Find it here by clicking to your left. If this narrative about the power of information and second chances resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the surprising turns that destiny can take. Do you also believe that sometimes the most casual encounters can completely change the course of our lives? We await you in the comments to learn about your experiences and reflections.